All right. Looks like we are and ready to rock. Hey, thanks for joining me this evening. And we got a nice show put together for you, something that is done once a year, and that's putting your plan together, your plan for competition, right? I want to discuss some things that you've never heard before. These are things that I'd never heard before, and all came down from the Olympic level and how the Olympians put together their year. Kind of rule of thumb for me is if it's done at the Olympic level, it works anywhere. If it works at the Olympic level, it works anywhere. And if it's not done at the Olympic level, I don't do it. So in this broadcast, I'm going to share with you how top athletes in the world plan their year for competition. Okay? There are key ingredients that can make or break you, okay? And we're going to talk about those key ingredients. And also what you should and shouldn't do in laying out your year of competition. Thanks for joining me. It's going to be a great lecture and paving your way or paving your path for a successful season. So if you've never met me before, I'm Sean Humphreys. I'm a high performance coach. I specialize in changing performance of individuals, whether you're a highly skilled athlete or you're on the way of being one, or maybe just want to improve your performance, you're in the right place. All right? So if we look at this, give me a thumbs up. Let me know that you can hear me, and give me a little smiley face, give me a little love. Also, hey, also let me know where you're joining us from. I always like to know the city and state and the country that you're watching from, because we have folks tuning in from all around the world. Also, know that you can catch this rebroadcast on my YouTube channel, all right? And love to field those requests and those questions as well. So let's kind of get into the nuts of this, right? So you're planning your year of competition, okay? Doesn't matter really what sport it is, especially if you are a sport that you're doing on your own, like if you're a lone wolf, like if you're in golf, or if you're in tennis, if you're in archery or rifle shooting, any type of individual sport that you're doing that, okay, it becomes a little bit more difficult because you've got to catch the more brunt end of the ownership in doing that, okay? But if you're in a team environment, it's a little bit easier, but I'm going to assume that you're in an individual sport right now, and that's what we're going to talk about this evening. So planning it can be a brutal task. However, as a competitor that is thriving through the stages of development, and you're developing your game as a competitor, it's critical you are strategic and highly tactical in doing this, okay? Especially if you're moving the needle in your performance. You know, the 4 stages that we talk about, and as we've talked about in other lectures, you know, the first stage is training to learn, and the second stage is training to compete, then training to the win, and then the final stage is really training to advance. That's kind of at the Olympic level in high-level sports such as MLB, winning another World Series, or in football, winning another Super Bowl. They want to advance themselves to another level. So those are conversations that we have in the NFL with the Saints and these guys, you know, wanting to win another Super Bowl. So it's important to know what stage that you're in. So the majority of the competitors, what I call the 95 percenters, will just wing it month to month and really they don't plan out their year. They just kind of react to what the month is, and if competition is available, they'll enter it, you know, 1 or 2 weeks out, and really no long preparation in advance. And you know, honestly, that's where the 95% rest. You know, they might schedule out their month, but that's kind of be it. And now on the other hand, the 5 percenters, you know, they're the ones that are doing all the winning 95% of the time. They do all the planning too. They do 95% of all the planning. And That's why they're in the 5%. And they do it well, they do it in advance, and they seem to have more time on their hands and not stressed out and complaining because they don't have enough time, because they do. And they realize that, just FYI, there's 168 hours in a week. And if you haven't ever thought about it, there is. So, as we work with our college coaches, they use that platform of managing those 168 hours a week, especially with our goal planning model that we've talked about. If you haven't had a chance to see that show, you need to check it out on the YouTube rebroadcast, the Olympic goal planning model. So it talks about that plan as well with the 168 hours. So it's important to manage that piece. So when you're planning out your year, the first thing, it's important, you have to determine the competition schedule, for the year. In most sports, there are several big events or major events or competitions scheduled for the year, and they're all brought together for a final national event, or could be a state event or a national event. And it's important to understand what these dates are so that you can start planning out your season. And so I've broken this down into several steps and some details around it. So let's get started here. So number one, you should schedule these events on your master calendar and in your performance analysis. So it should all be written down. We talk about this all the time. You need to be looking at it every day of what your schedule is going to be, because you're going to know what your training needs to be. So the first thing is you got to look at all the scheduled events, and you got to lay it out, okay? And once you have all your competition days scheduled, okay, that's number one. Look at your schedule, get the events, and once you have all the competition days scheduled, number two, you're going to count the number of training days that you have available until your next competition. And then after that competition, then you're going to count the next training days that are available for that next competition. And you're going to do so, and you're going to count all of your training days up that you have available to train outside of the competition. Okay? Now, number three, now you want to count the days available for the entire year. Okay? So you may be surprised just how few there are, So you've got to get the schedule. You've got to count the days of your training. Then you want to count the days available for the entire year that you have to do this. Okay? Now, number four, you've got to look for possible conflicts with your attendance for these special events. Okay? You've got to make sure that your big events don't conflict with any of your schedules. Okay, that's critical, especially if you're aspiring to be a collegiate golfer. Okay, if you're in high school and you're trying to work down this path to play in X amount of AJGA events a year, which are majors for a lot of people, the small percent, it's an everyday tour event for them. But the majority of the people, the AJGA events are their majors. Now, college students may not be able to, for example, college students, they may not be able to move their finals to go to a match, right? And that happens sometimes. But the coaches help them out with this, but they might be able to register in advance when they set up their classes so that they have Fridays free. And if the majority of the events, I know at the Ivy League school, they're always on the weekends, right? And a lot of the tournaments or sometimes they're Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, so they're the early part of the week. So that's critical in understanding that. Your goal is to maximize the hours you have available by planning in advance. And it's the only way that you can maximize your hours that are available is by planning in advance. And planning in advance reduces the loss of training days due to running out of maybe daylight, or the training facilities are closed, or due to holidays, or what have you. So the more that you plan this out in advance, you're going to have a much better chance of planning your days of training. Okay. Number 5, what you want to do is next we got to talk about the budget. Okay. And I'm a big believer that sitting down, if it's your kids or if it's your athletes, you've got to sit down, and I think it's important that they understand the budget, and because they're going to have to do this on their own one of these days. And I think it's a good system to follow, and I think it's good to get used to doing it. If you're fortunate, you have a coach or a manager who assists you in this step, and if you don't have any help, ask. A training budget has projections, and I've listed out, basically 5 or 6 areas here that need to be paid close attention to, right? So the first one is the equipment. You've got to have a budget for equipment. The next is you've got to have a budget for travel. Okay, you've got to have a budget for fees, entry fees, association fees, coaching fees. You need supplies, and those are supplies that are supplies for your competition. You've got food and beverage. You've got hotel expenses. Those actually kind of fall under travel, but I want to kind of dive into that a little bit as well. So putting that budget together is listing out everything. And I think it's important that we take our young athletes through this so that they get an understanding of what this is all about. So now we want to get into number 6 is, what new equipment will you need to reach your goal for the year, okay? And or if you need any, okay? What is your plan to acquire this equipment, and when is the best time to make purchases? There's always good times to make purchases, and if you're like our household, we're always trying to watch the dollar, right? And every dollar counts. And it's important to understand, there's certain times of the year that you buy equipment, right? And when is the best time to make an equipment change? We talk about this all the time. The best time to make an equipment change is in the off season. That's when you make an equipment change. You never make an equipment change in season. You just don't do it because you don't have time to commit to it and trust it and and grow your self-image so it becomes like you to use that equipment. So the off season is where you do it. So it's important to understand if you do need equipment, when's the time to purchase it? What's the best time? When are the best deals? Usually the winter time is the best, because not a lot of people are playing, and you can get your best deals. So number 7, what's the cost of your training with coaches? What kind of coaches do you need? It's important to know what your training looks like, to know what kind of coaches that you need, and understand what that budget is. If you're in an academy, is it a monthly fee? Or if you're taking one-offs and taking privates, you need to budget that for the entire year, what that number is going to be. Okay. As it relates to a travel budget, it's important to understand, I think, because I travel all the time, right? And I think it's important to understand how the airlines price their flights if you're flying. What I have found is that I fly American Airlines quite a bit, and I've actually kind of gone sometimes to the budget airlines, and I'll tell you about that in a minute, which is quite interesting. So for instance, American Airlines, every Wednesday they have their flight adjustments on pricing, and it starts at 12:30 on every Wednesday. And you can call or you can check. The best thing to do is they post them at 12:30 of when their adjustment's going to be for that week on their pricing. And man, it's crazy sometimes what you can get. But it adjusts back, I think, in a 72 hour period. So just know every Wednesday at 12:30, American Airlines, that's when they're going to adjust their prices on their flights. Now, I fly quite a bit and spend a lot of time at our facilities in West Palm Beach, and also on the road at the universities. And what I found is I've done some of the budget airline research, and I have literally been able to cut my travel budget. I mean, almost cut 3/4 of budget out to where it's a third of the price for me to fly now. I've used Spirit Airlines, and you know what? I've been able to fly from Dallas Fort Worth to West Palm Beach and to Fort Lauderdale as low as $100. I've flown for $98 one time round trip. It's usually anywhere from 98 to 100, 110. I mean, that's significant when you're doing it every month or even multiple times a month. So I can't drive for that. I can't drive across Texas for that, as a matter of fact. So these prices are pretty reasonable, and it's actually twice as reasonable, to fly than to drive, and in some cases it's 10 times more reasonable. So I would encourage you to check out those budget flights as well, but also look at the prices of baggage and all that stuff, because you're going to be bringing a lot of baggage. So, and I mean that in a good way on baggage, by the way. So the next step is, okay, what are the fees for the events that you're going to be competing in? Are there association memberships? Are there seminars that you have to go to? Are there coaching fees in regards to these events? Sometimes they have them. You've got to attend seminars, and you need to make sure that you're paying close attention to that. What supplies are you going to need, right? The supplies include the clothing that you're going to wear for the event, your competition outfits, right? Or your uniforms. One thing to keep in mind is that when you're playing in inclement weather, you've got to have a great all-weather outfit, like an incredible rain suit. It's paramount, because it's not a matter if it's going to rain, it's when it's going to rain. So you got to have a great rain suit on call at all times. You got to have plenty of golf balls in place. You got to have plenty of gloves. You're going to need shoes, of course, and what I have found is multiple pairs of shoes last a lot longer than one pair of shoes. And also, if you just have one pair of shoes, if it rains and they're wet, there is nothing worse than playing another round in a pair of wet shoes. It only took me once or twice to learn that lesson, and that was it. You got to have a travel case for your travel bag. I recommend a hard case. I really do. They protect your clubs, no doubt. I know they're a pain in the rear to deal with, but you know what's a pain in the rear is that when you have these soft bags and something's thrown on them, next thing you know, you open up, you got some bent clubs, or a couple of them are even broken. Okay. You're going to need an inclement weather cover for your bag. Do you use a pool cart? It's always good to stockpile your supplies or keep a par stock all the time. And also keep in mind of the sales, right? Sometimes you can stockpile on balls and gloves in the wintertime, and they're great for the spring. Okay. Now getting back to the number 8. So now when you get into, what we're going to do is we're going to break this down into quarterly sessions. Okay. So you divide your year into quarters. Okay. The length of your quarters are individual and sport specific. Okay, for the length of those quarters. Okay, but typically the first quarter, of your training year. Okay, the first quarter after you've finished your much needed rest. Okay, from the last season of competition, when we're going into the first quarter, you've got to evaluate your previous performance. Okay, you've got to reflect. You've got to sit down. This should be done, such as where were my goals for each event that I played in last season. Okay, you want to do an evaluation. You want to do a reflection. Also, just FYI, I was just looking here at my notes that I do have a YouTube lecture on that, on the Olympic goal planning model, that will talk a little bit about what those goals for competition and how you put those together. But you need to look back at your previous sessions or your previous year and look at all your events. And you need to have all this information written down after every event. So for example, you should be keeping your performance analysis from each day of your training and your competition so that you can go back and review. You got to review your goals, what you did well, what you learned, what solutions that you needed, why did you need these solutions, what area you trained in, and why you trained in these areas. All of that stuff is, compacted into our performance analysis, I don't leave home without it. This recaps my entire day, but it also recaps every single event that I play in. And what's cool about this is that at the front of the performance analysis, it's got a competition log. So I'm able to put the date, the competition, the results, and the page number in here. And so let's say that the season started and I'm on page 50 through 55 was the competition in Cincinnati, and this are the results. And so I can always go back and I look at my competition schedule from the previous year. It gives me the results, it gives me the page number, and I can go back and I can see everything right there, and I can reflect on everything and start building that plan. These things save you from having to do all the research and have to dig stuff out. So especially when you're writing it all down. So more importantly, if you don't manage it, we can't measure it, and we can't measure what we need to reflect on going into the next season. So during this session you should establish your training plan in this first quarter, right? You need to make your budget, and you need to set your schedule for the year. So there's a lot going on here in this first quarter of the season. Now, you've got to evaluate your equipment. You got to evaluate the techniques that you use. The biggest piece that I look at is you got to evaluate your knowledge acquisition. How much more knowledge do you need? Do you need changes in your plan to make or gain in the coming year? We're constantly working on the skill acquisition, but we've got to be working on the knowledge acquisition, knowing how to train, knowing how to take care of ourselves, knowing how to film our training, growing our self-image as we're training on a daily basis. It's critical for the steps in our success. Also, it gives us time to test new ideas. If you need new ideas or order new equipment, right? You got to evaluate it and make improvements to your equipment, during this part of the season. Later in the competition phase, you will not want to change things like equipment, right? Once the competition phase starts, you don't change equipment. It's just the worst thing that you can do, because you didn't have a chance to start building the trust and committing to it in a high stress situation. Okay. Now, during the second quarter, now we'll talk about the second quarter. This is where you concentrate on conditioning. Okay, and that's where you're concentrating on your physical conditioning, but also the conditioning for your sport and training for the sport. So in this quarter, you work especially hard on your training that will strengthen you, it will also help you for these demanding seasons ahead, right? So you got to get trained up, you got to get your body trained up, you got to get nutrition, you got to get the right amount of sleep. So in this second quarter, you've got to start ramping it up. So golf, is not a seasonal sport. Sometimes it is a seasonal sport, depending on where you are geographically and what area you're in. However, there's major competitions going on year-round in this sport, whether it's in South Florida, whether it's in Arizona, in Nevada, or Southern California, or even in the Caribbean. If your sport is not seasonal, you may have to compete in the conditioning season, okay? If so, understand that your competition has the same challenge, okay, of all the things that we're working on. So it was always motivating to me as a competitor to compete against my major competitors in the winter season. I always loved it because I got to see where they were, and it really helped me. If I seemed behind, I worked harder, right? If I was ahead, I worked even harder. Why? Because I knew that the competition was trying to catch me, right? So there's an advantage about competing year-round, but we have to learn how to take those breaks, okay? So now when we move it into the third quarter, Okay, during the third quarter, this is where you're ready for competition. Okay, you've gone through the planning phase, the first quarter, the second quarter, you've gone through all of your training. Okay, now the third quarter, you're ready for competition. This is the period where you are ramping up and getting ready for major competitions or leading up to the state championship or the national championship. By this time, you should be properly conditioned and at your best for having winning performances. Okay? I'm not saying that you're going to be at your absolute best, but you need to be at the best that you can possibly be at to have a chance to have winning performances. You should know that here's the important piece, and I stress this all the time with athletes, and I stress it even more with coaches. You need to know what it looks like on game day. You need to know what your game looks like on game day. And I'm not talking about it needs to look perfect, but what do you need to look like on game day to accomplish your goals? It's really important. If you don't know what it needs to look like on game day, there's probably a chance that you don't know what it looks like the week before. And if you don't know what it looks like the week before, 2 weeks out, 4 weeks out, 6 weeks, 8 weeks. Also then, if you don't know that, I'd look to your coach or your teachers, and if they don't know, then that could be problematic. It really could. Because I've always stressed to my athletes what they needed to look like on game day for them. We're not trying to look perfect. What they need to look like so they can compete based on their skill set, their knowledge, and their capacity, and it's important. Most athletes, or the 95 percenters, think they need to look perfect on game day. And if they're not, okay, they will immediately begin to over-try in competition. And I see this all the time. They're trying to be perfect, and if they're not, they're trying to be perfect in competition, and they're over-trying in competition. That's the kiss of death. They overtrain before, and then they over-try in competition, and that's where the 95%, because they're over-trying and they can't trust. The 5% just keep trusting and committing and running their steps of performance. So the third quarter is where you hammer out your competition. So the focus in this season is to have winning performances. And you're constantly evaluating your performances every single week. After every day, you're going to your performance analysis. Even in your training and preparing, you're writing everything down. Again, if you don't manage it, you can't measure it. And if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. It's almost a double-edged sword there, okay? Your training should be centered around replicating competition and raising your training so it has higher consequences than the competition. I mean, really no drills used in training at all in this third quarter. This is all about replicating training at the highest level to replicate competition. And if you get off that track, it's going to kill you. It really will. Now when we move into the fourth quarter, this is where we finished our competition season. Now we're into the fourth quarter. This is where we reset and we evaluate on how the season progressed. Okay? Just going to check something here. Okay? You've done your best at the major championships or the national events, and it's time for much needed rest. Okay? All right? Rest and repair and reflection, and don't make the mistake of, omitting this step. Don't make the mistake, okay? Don't think that in this fourth quarter that you think that you can jump ahead of your competitors or the competition by training overtime in this space. Chances are you will weaken yourself in the long run and you won't be able to make it through the whole season the next time. I see this, okay? You also need time away from the sport, okay? You want to reflect on it. You want to reflect on your goals. Again, looking back to your performance analysis, reflect on your goals, your training methods, and your concepts. Look back at everything. Look back at all the data that you recorded. And I'm not talking so much about the numbers. I'm talking about how you operate as an athlete, how you operate as, not only as a technique, but also how you operate from a mindset standpoint. How well do you build strategies? How well do you commit to those strategies? How well do you run the commitment phase? You have a mindset program. How well do you run that? In this period, it's time for you to establish also an outline for your training during the year. Okay, this is in that fourth quarter. This is where you're reflecting and you start laying out the outline. That's why it's so important to understand the knowledge acquisition piece. If you go through this a few times, you ought to be able to sit down and start laying out your training, following the Olympic training model, and doing this on a regular basis. And finally, you should set up your training objectives for the year in 3 major areas. Okay. So finally, we need to set up our training objectives for the year, and there's 3 major areas. Okay. First, we have to determine what objective you want to meet in your training by the end of each quarter. Okay. Out of each quarter, what is your objective that you want to meet in your training? Okay. Number 2, you have to determine how many hours you will average in each training day. You got to lay it out. As with the athletes that we work with, when they're at the college level, they're spending 4 hours a day in their training, and then when they're on their own, they're probably spending 4 to 5 hours a day. They get a couple days off a week. They're training a minimum 20 hours a week, minimum. Okay. If you're a high school player, you've got to balance your training. You've got to make sure that you're getting your training hours in and not just qualifying and playing all the time, because that doesn't quite take it to the level that you need to when your training can actually have higher consequences than the competition. So you got to determine your hours. You got to lay those hours out. And then third, you got to plan out how you're going to spend those hours. By following these guidelines, you can develop a well-planned program that should improve your results in competition for years to come. And when I first got exposed to this, I had no clue about planning, quarter. This is fantastic, And once I started learning this from the Olympic level, it made so much sense. And we started laying out the quarters. We even drew a graphic and broke down the quarters and what they look like for the season and how many hours are put together. And it just makes it so much easier to do this. And then when you start working in the performance analysis at the end of every training session, every competition, every qualifying, you've got all your information right here that you can go back to because you took the time to manage this while you were competing and training. And it becomes a game changer. So I hope you've enjoyed this session and it brought some insight to you on how to gain some organization and planning things out. If you've got questions, please hit me with them. I'd be more than happy to field those for you. Even if they're in the rebroadcast, I'll go back and check that on a regular basis. We do this every Wednesday, 8 p.m. Central, 9 Eastern, the EPS broadcast. If you know someone that could benefit from this broadcast, please pass it along. Also, if you're interested in being a part of our private client group, we have opened that back up. We've got some spots left for our collegiate onboarding program. I would be delighted to talk with you about your son or your daughter, or even if you're a coach and you have an athlete. My direct email is sean@seanhumphreys.com, or you can reach me on my direct line is 972-793-7255. Also, you can catch all these broadcasts on our YouTube channel at Sean Humphreys. And I'll tell you, we've got an incredible Kickstart program going on down in Palm Beach, Florida right now, where we're doing these 2 days collegiate training programs, and they are unbelievable. We get to use Palm Beach Atlantic University, which is one of the universities that I coach at, and also our private training facility there. You come in for 2 days, no interruptions, there was no one else around. It is pure private serenity in the warm weather of Florida here. So, man, it's a cool place to do it. You can check that out on my website at SeanHumphreys.com. Just click on the training, or you can give me a call to discuss. I hope you've enjoyed this as much as I have enjoyed putting it together for you. Have a great week, and I'll see you next Wednesday. Take care.